Hello and welcome back to my channel. On this video, I'm going to talk about all of the books that I read in May of 2026. I made headway on a bunch of different series and also some books that are kind of newer and have just come out, and it was a really good reading month. So first, I started out with one of the books in the Nevada Bar series. This is called Hard Truth. And I ended up reading actually several books in this series this month. So this was book number 13. I also finished book number 14, which is called Winter Study, book number 15, which is called Borderline, and book number 16, which is called Burn. There are only 3 books left in this series, so I'm hoping to wrap it up in the next month or so. And this is a mystery series that is long running. It is about a woman who works in national parks and solves mysteries, and every mystery takes place in a different national park. I love this series. I feel like every book is a little bit different in terms of obviously the mystery that's being put into the plot, but you see her character development over time, and it's just like a super interesting series. So looking forward to wrapping that up. I also picked up a book called The Secret by Beverly Lewis. This falls into the subgenre of like Amish mystery novels. And I don't think I'd read this author before. And it's basically the story of this Amish family where the mother kind of runs away and they're trying to figure out why and kind of what happened. What's interesting is that when the mother runs away, it's treated as kind of like a normal thing, and like they don't like report this to the police or anything like that, which may just be part of the Amish community component. But I thought it was kind of interesting that like this woman kind of disappears and people are just kind of like taking it in stride, which I thought was interesting. I would definitely pick up more books by this author in the future. I felt like this book was a little bit of like a palate cleanser, and so I could use it that way in the future. Next, I read a book called We're Not Broken, Changing the Autism Conversation by Eric Garcia. This is one of many books that I have read around neurodivergence. And this book I really appreciated. It is from the lens of like his perspective as a political journalist, and also his perspective as somebody who is autistic. And he talks about a number of different things within the autistic community and like the different kinds of challenges that people are facing and the ways that they are engaging those challenges through different kinds of support structures. I find these books in general just very interesting, and especially when they're written from the perspective of somebody who identifies in this way. Next, I picked up a book called Glue, which is about project leadership and how to have like good team engagement. This is by An Do Pham, and I really appreciated this book because it's very practical. This is an author that has clearly led many teams, many projects, and brings a lot of that perspective into this book. Lots of like little tips and tricks and things like that. And I love books on team and how to lead teams. And so I found it really interesting. Next, I picked up Her Beautiful Life by Brianna Labuskis, and this is a book about a woman who goes to visit an old friend who she hasn't been in touch with for a while, and that old friend is a trad wife influencer, and there's a mystery involved, and kind of you learn a lot about their past relationship and then their kind of present day engagement. And I found this book, I feel like there's kind of this subgenre around trad wife influencers right now. Obviously, Yesteryear is kind of the one that everybody has been reading. I read that one as well. I liked the mystery of this. I liked, there's a component of it that I liked in terms of the narration that I feel like would give something away. And so I'm not gonna go into detail, but I did appreciate kind of like the twist, especially at the very end of the book, and thought it was interesting. Then I read a book called The Break-In by Katherine Faulkner, and this is a book about a woman who has somebody break into her home, and when she is there with her children, and she kills this person, and is then like feeling like guilt about it, but also just like confusion about like why was this person breaking into her home, and she feels like there's something going on, and there's kind of like a backstory, and she's trying to figure out what it is. And so eventually we do learn, you know, like why this person was breaking into her home and what was going on. And I could definitely see a book like this being adapted into like a TV show because of just the way that it was kind of plotted. And I'm glad I picked that one up. Then I read all 5 books in the Off-Campus series by Elle Kennedy. It starts with The Deal, and then there's The Mistake, The Score, The Goal, and then a series of short stories into one book called The Legacy, which kind of like follows on each of the couples that are covered in the first 4 books. And I wanted to read this obviously because it is an adaptation on Amazon Prime, and a lot of people have been talking about it, and I wanted to read the books before I watched the show. And I did actually watch the pilot of the show the other day just to kind of like see what it was all about. And I can already tell differences in what is happening between the books and the show. And this is why I like to read the books first, is to see like what is the creative license that's taken with an adaptation. But basically, these are books that center around college athletes on a hockey team, and they have various relationships with women who are also at college with them. And each one has a bunch of like mixed tropes in terms of what's happening. In the first book, it covers the story of a girl, a woman who has like a crush on this other guy. And so she decides to fake date this hockey player while also like tutoring him for a class to make this other guy jealous. And so this is the deal that they're kind of making, which is the title of the book. And that is basically the first season of Off Campus. It also covers one of the other couples in one of the other books in the show in terms of what's like coming up in that first season. So I'm glad I read all of it before I started to watch the show, because I think it's worth seeing all the storylines before you're introduced to them in the adaptation. Next, I read a book called The Girls Before by Kate Ellis Marshall. I first ran across this author with a YA book that she had written, and now she is writing mysteries for adults. This is a book that kind of intertwines the story of a woman who is kidnapped, a woman who's like a search and rescue expert, and then she has like this person in the past that went missing and is trying to figure out what happened like to her best friend. And all these stories are kind of intertwined. And it involves kind of this like very wealthy family in this smaller town. And a lot of like, I would say like relatively traditional mystery elements in this one, but the way that the stories are kind of interwoven was very interesting. I will definitely keep reading books by this author. Then I picked up In the Bones by Tessa Wiegert, and this is a newer author to me as well. This is the story of a woman who is cleaning the house of somebody who is kind of a wealthy, I think he's like a former athlete or something like that. And as part of her like relationship with this person who's hired her, like she comes to be in the house when there is a body found in the basement. And so then the mystery of like, who is this body and what has happened and who put the body there. And this person has recently purchased this house, so wasn't, you know, there for a long time. And so it's like anybody could have done this. And, you know, what is the story behind this crime, you know, that has happened? And I would definitely read another book by this person in the future. I liked, it was a little bit more on the like police procedural side of the kind of like small town, you know, murder. Definitely not a cozy mystery. But I like police procedurals, and I felt like the perspective of the police officer and like the ways that that is kind of being interwoven with the woman who is like the cleaning person for this house was super interesting. And like we're definitely seeing like the setup of characters. I don't know if this is a series, but I think it could be, just because of like how the characters are being introduced. Then I picked up a book by Amanda Holden called How to Be a Rich Old Lady. And this is a book on finance. I tend to actually really enjoy books on finance, and I had seen this one around. And I would say this is a book that isn't necessarily just for women, but the author is definitely trying to provide financial advice and assistance to people who wouldn't normally receive it. And so one of the things that I appreciated about this book is it's very step-by-step. It is absolutely accessible, especially if you're like, have no background in finance, have no idea what any of this stuff is. She's really breaking down a lot of terms and concepts and strategies that I found to be, you know, like really easy to understand based on how she was talking about it. I also thought that this book was, for me, like affirming, because I felt like there were a lot of things that she talked about that I was like, yes, like I have either done that or I have like, I'm aware of that as a strategy. And so it also helped me to kind of understand my own literacy around like personal finance, which I thought was kind of an interesting component too. Then I picked up a book called The Storyteller. This is by Dave Grohl. Dave Grohl is a musician who was in the band Nirvana, and then he also fronted the Foo Fighters and has been involved in a lot of other, you know, music performances, like combining a bunch of different artists. And I will admit, when I first opened this book, I thought, am I going to be bored by this? Because while I, you know, listened to Nirvana and listened to the Foo Fighters, like, I don't know that I'm kind of like a deep fan of like either of those, you know, musical groups. And I was like, okay, like, is this going to be interesting to me? And I actually found it to be super fascinating. The book is read by Dave Grohl, which I find helpful. He also references a bunch of things that I was able to look up. So for example, he talks about one of the music videos that was filmed for Nirvana. And I actually went on YouTube and found the music video and watched it like after he was talking about it to kind of like see, you know, the kinds of things that he was referencing. He talks about doing a musical performance with one of his daughters. That is also something that's available on YouTube to watch. So there was a lot of ways that I felt like this book could be more interactive if you were interested in kind of like seeing some of the history and the moments that he's talking about throughout the book. I also read 2 books in a trilogy called the Illuminae Files. This is by Amy Kaufman and Jay Kristoff. And the first book is called Illuminae, and then at the very end of the month, I read the second book, which is called Gemina. And this is a series that is super creative. What I would actually recommend is I had it on audio. I also had a physical copy of the book because the physical copy of the book has a lot of graphic elements in it where the fonts look different depending on what kind of information you're being given about the situation. This is a book that is about basically teenagers in space trying to like save their civilizations. And book 1 follows one couple, book 2 follows a second couple. And I haven't read book 3, so I'm assuming it's either both of those couples combined or a third couple. And it was just like, this was a 5-star read for me, both of these books, because I loved the creativity of the writers. I loved how they pulled the information together, the plot, the characters, like their ability to kind of do this through like, like chat room snippets and like, like files and transcripts and like the way that they're kind of pulling all these different artifacts together to tell the story of what happened is super interesting. So I'm definitely going to read book 3. And I would recommend, if you don't read the physical copy, have the physical copy in front of you while you're listening to it, because I think it does make a difference in terms of like understanding what's actually going on. Next, I picked up a book called The Renaissance Soul. This is by Margaret Lobenstein. And this is a book about people who like to have a lot of different interests and like their careers might reflect that. And there are a lot of books in this subgenre that have talked about this, but this is one of the earlier ones. And I like reading books in this category as somebody who has multiple interests, who likes to incorporate different kinds of things into my work, but also because when I am coaching people around career, this kind of thing often comes up where people don't want to have just like a very linear track in their careers. So I really like this. I found it to have like tons of really good examples and a lot of different like tools and approaches to be kind of thinking about this for your own, kind of like personal application if that's of interest to you. Next, I picked up a book called How Leaders Learn by David Novak. And this is subtitled Master the Habits of the World's Most Successful People. And I appreciated this book to some extent. I liked that the author had, like with these kinds of books, I like a lot of examples. And so that was included. But I would say that I was hoping for more. I felt like this book was like a little bit ho-hum to me. And I ended up listening to it on audio. I have a hard copy of it as well. And it just there wasn't a lot that stuck. Like I didn't feel like the examples were especially like innovative or interesting. And the kinds of things that he's talking about that are like learning approaches that leaders are taking, like none of it was anything that was like brand new to me. And so I appreciate the concept of this book, but I feel like in execution, it just wasn't as interesting as I was hoping it would be. Next, I read The Forest for the Trees by Betsy Lerner. This is an older book by an editor at a publishing house who becomes an agent. And she is basically breaking down the book publishing world. I really appreciated this book. I think it's very well written. I think it's very accessible if this is an area that you don't know a lot about. And I actually, I've read quite a bit about back-end publishing. I've experienced it myself as somebody who's published multiple books. But because I've published mostly in the academic space and not necessarily in trade publishing, there was a lot here that was kind of interesting. She brings in a ton of literary examples, which I thought was super fascinating. This is a book that I could see recommending and also potentially reading again, just because I found it to be really fun and full of information that was new to me. Next, I picked up Leading Impactful Teams. This is a project management book by James Luteet, and this is a book that I really appreciated because the author is basically talking about project management and leading teams for people who are maybe not formally trained in project management. So he's got some fun illustrations that he's included in this book. He's trying to break things down into a really approachable, applicable way to kind of think about leading teams. He also, in the very beginning of the book, basically talks about something that happened with his physical health that very much impacted how he approaches work-life balance, which I thought was really interesting and a way to kind of open the book and kind of be thinking about that throughout. So this one was a fun one. I'm glad that I picked it up. Next, I read The Science of Organizational Change. This is by Paul Gibbons, and this is a book that I thought was a really good introduction to change management, to behaviors of change, and to how you can lead change in an organization. That may feel kind of obvious based on the title of this book, but I do feel like this is a book that I would consider to be kind of foundational in this literature. It overviews a lot of studies. It's also myth busting a lot of studies where we kind of think it happens in a particular way, and he's saying like, no, in practice it actually happens in this other way. And I appreciate like any book that is kind of taking common understandings of things and saying like, here's what's correct and here's what's not, and here's the evidence that shows you that. So this one was super interesting to me as well. Then I picked up Jolted by Anthony Klotz, subtitled Why We Quit, When to Stay, and Why It Matters. This is a book that I was aware of, and I had purchased a copy, and then I had a colleague read it and recommend it to me. And so I was like, okay, let me move this to the top of my list. And I found this book to be super interesting. This is an author who basically studies this concept of like quitting and people like moving out of jobs. And there was a lot of like little facts and interesting information from his own research about like why people quit and how they quit and how it can impact their future careers. And like, for example, one of the things he talks about is if somebody is laid off, they're like 40% more likely to quit a job in the future. And that to me was really interesting in terms of just like the dynamics of quitting, the psychology of quitting, and how it kind of shows up for people. And so anyway, I thought this was super fascinating. Again, I love books on career. And this is just like one component of career is when you decide to move on from a particular job or opportunity. Then I read The Crow Trap by Ann Cleeves. And this is the first book in her series that is called Vera Stanhope. And Vera Stanhope is a detective. And in this particular book, what I would say is, I feel like it was really ambitious for a first book in a series. I'm not sure if this is Ann Cleeves' like first book ever, but it was definitely setting up a lot. And the mystery was very complex. It was longer. This particular book is like almost 600 pages long. And I would definitely read more in this series just because I know that it is a beloved series and it has been adapted and, you know, there's a lot of like really good stuff here, but it did read as a first book in a series to me, which is basically meaning like people are getting, they're kind of setting up the characters and like, it's not an established series. And so like I could feel that as I was like reading the first book. It reminded me a little bit of Elizabeth George's work, who I love, and I've read her entire like long-running mystery series as well. And so I will definitely like revisit more in this series, but I want to make sure I'm setting aside time because like the books are long and they're involved, and like I want to make sure that I'm like getting the most out of that experience. Then I picked up a book called The Bright Sword by Lev Grossman. Lev Grossman is probably best well known for the Magicians trilogy that he wrote. And this particular book is kind of a retelling of a King Arthur story where there's a boy who kind of a late teens boy who goes to join the Knights of the Round Table. And when he gets there, he finds that King Arthur has died and some of the knights have died. And like the only knights that are left are the ones that are kind of like the bedraggled, you know, like knights. And so he joins this group and they go on a bunch of adventures together. I will say that like King Arthur and Arthurian literature is not something that I am like often seeking out. Like there are some people who love this kind of thing and I'm aware of it. I mean, I'm an English major, so I studied it when I was in college. And so I know kind of like the basics, but I did really enjoy this. I felt like Lev Grossman, first of all, did a ton of research to make sure that this was going to be, you know, like accurate in the way that it needed to be. But also you could just tell that he's having fun, like setting up these adventures of these knights and like thinking about how all these stories are woven together. There were also several stories of these knights that are kind of like broken out within the book. And so you get like a deeper dive on their backgrounds and their stories. And Lev Grossman also kind of weaves in these kind of like queer retellings of some of these stories as well, which I thought was also kind of an interesting component. So this one was really fun. Then I picked up a book called The Revenge Game by Jax Calder. This is a queer romance about a man who is now like a billionaire, actually. So let me back up to say, in high school, he was bullied by a football player. Now he is a grown man. He has sold a tech company. He has gazillions of dollars. And he runs into this football player. And the football player who like traumatized him in high school does not remember him. And they're now, so he decides he's going to get revenge on this guy. And he decides to, like, because he's just sold his company and he has nothing better to do, he's going to like work at this guy's company as like a tech support person and like mess with him basically and try to get revenge. And eventually over the course of the book, they build a friendship and then it turns into more. And you learn all the backstory of like what happened in high school and what led to this guy being a bully and all these kinds of things. I like this book way more than I thought I was going to, just based on like the description. And once I got into it, I was just turning the pages. Like I really did want to know what happened. There is a second book that I'm planning to read in this upcoming month that is a follow-on to this one, and really looking forward to it. I really enjoyed this one. Next, I picked up a book called Marrow by Trisha Wolfe, and this is co-written with Brynne Weaver. And Brynne Weaver is a pretty well-known author. She is known for the Ruinous Love trilogy, which is basically about serial killers who are falling in love. And Trisha Wolfe, I don't know if I have read this person before. I don't think I have. She's also, it looks like, known for kind of dark romance. So in this book, Marrow, this is about two serial killers who are operating in the same territory. And they don't necessarily, one of them knows that one of them is a serial killer. The woman knows the man is, but the man does not know the woman is. And basically what happens in this book is they're actually like faculty. They work in this body farm, and they study like the science of decomposition. And I don't want to give too much away, but basically what we learn is that the woman has known about the man and what he has been doing for a very long time. She's actually been kind of following him. And the man has no concept of like that they have interacted in the past, and like he does not remember this, and it becomes very clear why once you understand the situation. What I would say about this particular book is how they come to meet, like initially, and like it's basically her like serial killer origin story. Super fascinating. I like books that talk about kind of the psychology behind this kind of thing. However, what I would say is some trigger warnings in this book around, like, this is definitely a dark romance. And there's like one particular scene that kind of like goes deeper into the concept of consent. And I will admit, when I read it, I was like pretty uncomfortable. Like I was like, okay, this is like a really interesting lens through which to think about this. And so I would just note that like this is darker. I would definitely put it in the dark romance category. And I don't think this is part of a series. I think this is a standalone. But if you're interested in dark romance and in this concept of kind of serial killers falling in love, either one of these authors seems like they would be a good one to check out. Then for something completely different, I picked up a book called The Fault Between Us by Stephanie Lansom. This is a book about three sisters. It falls under the inspirational fiction category. So if you want to think about it as Christian fiction, and it's about three sisters. It's a historical story about how they are part of an earthquake. And this is a real earthquake that actually happened in Yellowstone Park. And they have to kind of like survive this earthquake. I thought the premise of this sounded like super interesting, but the earthquake itself doesn't happen until like well over halfway through the book. And some of the things that are set up between the sisters and their father, and then one of the sisters and her husband, like they're interesting, but I thought that it was like a little loose in terms of like, I think it could have been tightened up. I think it could have been more tightly edited. I may or may not pick up something from this author in the future, because I think that like the setup was good in terms of like the premise of this, but the execution was not as good as I was hoping. All right, then I picked up Warning Signs by Tracy Sierra. This is about a boy who goes on this like camping trip with his father, and they run into these other men, and it's a book that is definitely kind of like a thriller, and you're not sure like who you can trust and what's exactly going on, and like obviously all of that is explained like by the time you get to the end of the book, but it's a very atmospheric book. Like this is a book that if you like thriller novels and you want to read something that is kind of like scary and has like vibes and is atmospheric, like I would definitely consider picking it up. I like this one. I mean, the twist at the end was not necessarily something I was anticipating. And I actually ended up reading this while I was on a flight. And so it made the time pass very quickly just because of the nature of the writing. Then I picked up Mad Mabel by Sally Hepworth. This is falling into a more popular subgenre that is happening recently about old women who commit murder. And I've read several books in this subgenre because they're all very popular. And in this particular book, there's this older woman who has this reputation as being someone who was killing people when she was younger. And she befriends this young girl as an old woman. She's like in her 80s. And then there's a crime that happens in her neighborhood. And we get to hear the history of why she has this reputation. And then we're also kind of solving this mystery of this neighbor who is killed. And this book was, I mean, it's all about murder, so it's hard to say a book like this is charming, but it was charming. And I think that the old woman main character and the story that she kind of tells over the course of the book, super compelling. I can see why this one is really popular, and I'm really glad I picked it up. Next, I read Anatomy of an Alibi by Ashley Elston, and I have read at least one other book by this author and really enjoyed it. This is the story of two women who decide to basically kind of switch identities so that one of them can kind of spy on the partner of the other one. And then the partner ends up being killed, and they're all trying to set up alibis because of this situation and like who's going to be blamed for this. And of course, we get more information about like the history of the relationship and what this guy was like embroiled in, that he would be the victim of a murder. There is a cop character that is also being given like a point of view throughout this book as well. And I would say this is like relatively standard fare in terms of like what I've seen coming out recently with these kinds of thriller mysteries, but it was well written and well plotted, and I would definitely read more from this author in the future. Next, I read a book called Wait for Me by Amy Jo Burns, and this is a book about, at its core, it's about music. It is about two singer-songwriters who are separated by several decades, and the younger one is basically like there's like a meteor that hits and it unearths something about the older singer-songwriter who had gone missing many decades before. And they end up getting connected, these two women, like through their stories and through their music. And the audiobook of this book has music elements in it. So there is singing that is included in the audiobook. So I would just note that if that's of interest to you. And I like this one. I thought it was super creative. I loved that the lyrics were part of the story and that you got to have that kind of component in the book as well. Then I picked up Eragon by Christopher Paolini. This is a book about a 15-year-old boy who finds a dragon's egg and then raises the dragon. And I would say that if you like books about 15-year-old boys who find dragon eggs, like you would love this. Like I can see why it was so popular at the time. I can see why people were just completely obsessed with it. I feel like I am no longer the demographic for this book. As somebody in my early 40s, like I'm not necessarily looking for the 15-year-old boy finding dragon eggs. But I really did enjoy it. And it was one of those books that was around as I was growing up, and I wasn't like a huge fantasy reader as like an adolescent and teenager. So I'm glad I went back to it. And I thought that, I don't know that I will continue to read. I think this is like a trilogy or a series. I don't think I will continue to read in it, but I am glad that I was able to experience it and see what the fuss is about. All right, then I picked up Such a Perfect Family by Nalini Singh. And this is a book that I really like this. So it goes back and forth between the main character and like what he's experiencing, and then these like police reports that are also about the main character. And basically what happens is the book opens with a male main character, and he comes back to a house of his new wife's family, so his in-laws, and the house is on fire. And some people survive this fire and some people do not. And this fire is especially suspicious because he has been with other women in his life and they have also ended up dead. And so these police reports are kind of like adding some kind of like flavor to understanding like his past, his history, how he was involved with these other women. And then he is also trying to understand what has happened, you know, with this fire. And with this like new set of family members that he doesn't know very well, because he basically got like married in Vegas, basically, like to this woman. Like they haven't known each other super long, and she has a past and a history that he's like still unearthing. And this book was super smart. I would absolutely read another book by this author. I thought it was really well written, really tightly plotted. I loved the back and forth with the police reports and with the like present day what was going on. And I listened to this on audio, but I had a hard copy of it as well that I was kind of dipping in and out of, and it was really good. Then I read basically back to back the first 3 books in the Lancaster Family series by Sarah Eden. And this is a series that I came across because the first book, which is called Seeking Persephone, has been adapted into a television show. And so I kept seeing it referenced like on social media, and I realized it was a book series, and so I decided to pick it up. These are great. There's 5 total books in the series. I will absolutely read the remaining 2. I listened to them all on audio. And in the first book, basically, there's a woman who is married off to a duke because he's basically trying to save his land and keep it in his family. And he doesn't have an heir. And so like they are matched, into this marriage. And he has baggage from his childhood, and she is like, has no idea what's going on, with this guy. And they end up, eventually, becoming friends and then falling in love. And then the other books in this series are about like her sisters, and I think she has a brother that comes up later in the series as well. And so these are definitely Regency romance. I would also say that they are very clean. I think in the first book there are like 2 kisses. It's a very clean romance. And they're lovely. They're just so charming. And the characters and the family, and like the Duke, who's like this very gruff, it's a little bit of like a Beauty and the Beast retelling. And I really like them. I just sped right through them. So I read the first 3. The first one is Seeking Persephone. The second one is Courting Miss Lancaster. The third is called Romancing Daphne. And I will definitely pick up the other 2 remaining in the series as well. Next, I read The Secret Lives of Murderers' Wives by Elizabeth Arnott. This is basically about a group of women who were at some point in their lives married to serial killers or murderers, and they have found each other in like a kind of a support group kind of thing. And now they're trying to solve a bunch of murders that have happened recently to women, and they think they're all connected. And so they're trying to understand how they're all connected. And the reveal at the end is great. I found it to be like a really great twist. I would say in the beginning, because I listened to this on audio, I had like a little bit of a hard time keeping the story straight of these women and their histories with these men that they'd been involved in, and the crimes that they committed and all of that. But overall, I like this one. I thought it was really interesting. Next, I picked up Curse of Shadows and Thorns. This is the first book in the Broken Kingdom series by L.J. Andrews. And this is a book that I will admit, I wasn't sure what I would think of it. By the end, I was pretty sucked in. I have this on audio. I think there's like 9 books in this series. And so I'm launching in, and we'll see how far I get in terms of the other books in the series. This reminded me a lot of Jennifer Armentrout. So if you are familiar with her work, she basically writes fantasy romances or romantasy. And this had a very similar feel in terms of like what the setting of the book itself. And the other thing that I should check on this, but I suspect that I am correct. I think the audiobook narrator is the same for Jennifer Armentrout as it is for this series, which is also like in my mind just like connecting the series because of the voice of the narrator. I think they're the same person. So this was a great start to the series. The general plot of this is there is a princess and a rogue, and the princess kind of like likes to sneak out of the castle, and the rogue like catches her sneaking out of the castle, and he also is the person who's supposed to help her navigate like becoming engaged, and like all of her suitors have to like go through this guy, and of course they have feelings for each other, and so that comes into the narrative quite a bit. And then there is a coup that like upends the kingdom, and she has to flee with him. And I mean, it's a great setup for the first book in the series. So I will definitely continue the series and see what happens to these characters. Next, I read a book called What Happened Next by Edwin Hill. This is the story of a man who is now grown, but as a child, his father attempts to kill his mother like right in front of him. And it's in his awareness, it's because his mother was cheating on his father with this other man who he also, is attacking, in this situation. They have this cabin, that the family goes to, and he is returning to this cabin as an adult to create a podcast, like a true crime podcast about the situation with his family. Now, of course, we come to understand, and I should also mention, after his father does this, he disappears. He is never caught. They don't know where he is. And so there's this also like looming thing about like what happened to his father. And I thought this book was pretty solid. I've read this author before, and I liked the, like, again, kind of like the ambiance and like the setting of this cabin and like the small town and all the characters that are coming together. And also the fact that he like grows up with a bunch of people and then they're coming back together as adults. And so you kind of see their progression over time and how they've like developed these relationships with each other now that they are adults. And so there was like a maturity to the plotting of this that I found like super interesting in terms of like how the author was bringing all the components together. So I would definitely read more from him in the future. All right, next I read a book called In Case I Go Missing by R.N. Swan. This is an advanced reader's copy of a book that is coming out either at the end of May or beginning of June. And this is like a wonderful YA mystery. It is similar in some ways to A Good Girl's Guide to Murder. So if you're familiar with that trilogy, it also reminded me of Holes, which is another kind of YA book because it's about treasure hunting. So it's a mystery about a girl who goes missing and then her two friends who are trying to find her. And then there's gold that they're searching for. And it's also about kind of like a coming of age story for this teenage girl and her best friend. And I loved it. I loved it. I would totally read another book by this author. I thought all of the elements came together perfectly. Like, it was super fun to read this one. Next, I read An Insider's Perspective on the Chief of Staff. This is by Emily Sander. And I have an interest in this kind of role. I have done this kind of work in my own career. And also, like, I just thought it would be interesting to read, you know, about this concept of a chief of staff, because it is a very, like, flexible role that ends up kind of both, like, reaching into different parts of an organization, but also, like, bringing those parts together in terms of team development. And so anyway, I wanted to pick up, you know, this book. It's very short. It's like 125 pages. And so this was kind of like a quick, like, easy thing for me to pick up and read. And I would say that there wasn't a ton here that was new to me, but I think that's also because I'm more familiar with these kinds of roles. If you are interested in this kind of role and you have never encountered it, or you've never like worked with, you know, a chief of staff and you don't really know much about it, it might be something to consider picking up. Okay. Next, I read Into the Drowning Deep by Mira Grant. I came across this randomly on social media, and somebody was saying they were just starting it. And I was like, I've never heard of this. I've never heard of this book. I've never heard of this author. It is like from 2017, so it's almost 10 years old. And this author has like a prolific backlist. I've just never encountered her before. And this is a book about basically a boat that goes missing. And then there's this expedition to go out and try to find what happened to this boat. And I don't want to go into like too much detail here. I will say this is ocean horror, which is not my typical genre. I'm not typically a horror reader. I was completely sucked in. I started this book on a Friday night and I finished it on Saturday morning. Like, I was so interested in like what was happening in this book. I did not expect to read it as quickly as I did, but like as soon as I started, I was just like, I want to continue to read this. It reminded me a little bit of like early Michael Crichton, because it has this like kind of science-y element to it that is super fun. And there is like a very big element in it that I don't want to give away, because like the way it's introduced is just like, I would recommend going in blind to this one. Like, I think that don't read a ton about it. Just if this is interesting to you, just pick it up and read it. And I think you'll just love it. Like I would definitely pick up stuff from this author's backlist. And I'm looking forward to checking out some of her other work. Next, I read Start at the End by Emma Gray. This is one of those books that's a bit of a tearjerker. I had heard that it was. I did not cry reading this book, but I could definitely see why other people would. Basically, this is a sliding doors kind of narrative. And if you are familiar with the movie Sliding Doors, it's basically this concept of life going two different directions because of one event. And that is what happens. So there's basically a setup in the very beginning of this book. I would say we're about halfway in, and then something happens and it splits and you get two different storylines. This book was so well done. Like, in terms of like the way that it's structured alone, that part I really enjoyed. There's a component of it that is tied to musicians. Like, there's multiple characters in this book who are musicians, and that gets kind of woven throughout the storyline. I don't want to give much more away. I went into this book not really understanding a whole lot about it. I think you could read the description and it wouldn't necessarily spoil anything, but I definitely like this one and I would absolutely pick up other books by this author in the future. All right, those are all of the books that I read in May of 2026, quite a few, and I am looking forward to my next month of reading. You can check out my June TBR video as well if you're interested in what is on my stack for this next month. And until I see you again in the next video, happy reading.